Did you know that something as simple as salt was once worth its weight in gold? For many early societies, salt functioned like currency. By 6000 BCE, people in what is now Romania were already harvesting salt from springs, a sign that long before coins or kings, this tiny crystal shaped lives and livelihoods. Salt didn't just season food, it sparked wars, funded empires, and set the terms for survival itself. But how did a mineral you can hold in your hand become so powerful? And why did humanity depend on it for more than just taste? The answer stretched from ancient trade routes to underground cathedrals carved out of salt. Stories that reveal just how much of our world has been built on this unassuming substance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to consider what would it be like if your very survival hinged on finding a handful of salt. Salt, the silent architect of civilization. For early humans, this mineral was more than just a seasoning. It was a lifeline. Our bodies depend on salt, but long before anyone understood the chemistry, people realized its value through experience. Salt could do what nothing else could: keep food edible for far beyond its natural lifespan. That single discovery changed everything. Now, in the world before refrigeration, food spoiled fast. Imagine you living in a small group, hunting and gathering just to make it to tomorrow. You land a big catch, a deer, maybe a few fish. You feast, but the leftovers. Without salt, they rot within days. But rub salt into that meat or fish, and suddenly you have food that lasts for weeks, sometimes months. It's not just about making it through winter. It's about having a cushion, something to fall back on when the hunt fails or the harvest is thin. Salt gave early humans a way to store food, and with that, a way to stay put. No more chasing herds across endless plains or packing up camp every time the berries ran out. Instead, people could settle near rivers, lakes, or fertile valleys. They could plant crops, raise animals, and build their first real homes. With a stable food supply, these communities grew. Villages turned into towns, and towns turned into cities. In short, salt helped turn survival into security. But getting salt wasn't simple. You couldn't just scoop it up from the ground. Early people had to track it down, sometimes to remote salt springs, sometimes to the seashore, sometimes to rocky outcrops where salt crusted over ancient beds. Archaeological finds in Romania show that as early as 6000 BCE, people were boiling salty water from springs to extract salt. That's serious dedication. They invented ways to gather and process salt long before most other technologies, all because the stakes were so high. And salt wasn't always nearby. Some communities lived right next to natural sources, while others had to travel miles, sometimes risking their lives. Some journeys cost lives, underscoring salt's value. The effort it took to get salt only increased its importance. If you had a reliable supply, you had an advantage. If you didn't, you had to trade, beg, or move. This is where Salt's story starts to get interesting. Once people could preserve food, they could travel further. If your group wanted to cross a desert or follow herds on a long migration, carrying fresh food was impossible. But with salted meat or fish, you could make the journey. Salt let people push boundaries, moving into new territories, brave harsher climates, and surviving lean times that would have wiped out less prepared groups. And as groups settled down, Salt's role shifted. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It became a foundation for society. Permanent settlements meant more mouths to feed, more food to store, and more need for salt. The ability to gather, process, and store salt became a mark of progress. It's no accident that some of the earliest traces of organized human activity are linked to salt production. In Romania, people built simple structures around salt springs. In ancient Egypt, salt from dry lake beds preserved fish and meat for the afterlife. In China, by around 800 BCE, people were already drawing brine from wells and boiling it down for salt. Across Europe, the Celts carved salt out of the mountains at Hallstatt, Austria. Everywhere you look, salt was there, quietly shaping the course of history. Salt also brought people together, and sometimes drove them apart. If you lived near a salt source, you could trade it for grain, tools, or livestock. If you didn't, you had to find a way to get it. Salt became one of the first true commodities, carried along trade routes that stretched for hundreds of miles. Traders hauled blocks of salt across the desert, along rivers, and over mountains. People built roads just to move salt. In some places, whole economies sprang up around its trade. The story of salt is the story of ingenuity. Early humans didn't just stumble on salt and use it as they found it. They figured out how to collect it in different ways, scraping it from rocks, evaporating seawater, boiling down brine. They built tools and invented methods that would last for generations. Salt wasn't just a resource, it was a craft, a tradition, and, in many ways, a source of pride. And yet, for all its importance, salt remained hidden in plain sight. It was everywhere and nowhere, essential but easy to overlook. Without salt, none of the advances we take for granted would have ever happened. There would be no stored food, no settled villages, no time to invent or build or dream. Salt preserved more than meat and fish. It preserved possibility. It let people plan for the future, not just survive the present. But once communities settled, salt became more than survival. It became power. How did this tiny crystal build empire? For centuries, the most valuable currency wasn't gold or silver. It was something you might barely notice as you shake it over your fries or sprinkle it into boiling water. Salt, this crystal didn't just flavor dinner. It built roads, paid wages, and fed armies. It helped empires rise and kept them standing. In the ancient world, salt wasn't a garnish. It was life insurance policy. As society grew, salt's value only increased. Preservation was still essential, but now salt became the foundation of trade, taxation, and political power. Whoever controlled salt controlled wealth. Losing access could mean disaster. Salt wasn't just a resource, it was leverage, a bargaining chip, and sometimes the reason for conflict itself. If you had salt, you had the upper hand. If you didn't, you were at the mercy of those who did. Take Rome. The Romans didn't just use salt, they built their empire around it. The Via Salaria, Salt Road, was one of the main arteries into the city. It was constructed for a single reason: to transport salt from the coast to the capital. This was no dusty path. It was a lifeline, carrying the empire's most prized commodity straight into its heart. Roman soldiers sometimes received their pay in salt, a practice that gave rise to our word salary. Imagine that. Your paycheck measured not in coins, but in crystals. Your ability to buy food, support your family, or save for the future depended on a handful of salt. That's how deep the connection ran. Head north, and you find the salt mines of Hallstatt in Austria. By 1200 BCE, the Celts had established one of the earliest known salt works there. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were complex operations, with tunnels and wooden staircases carved deep into the mountain. The Celts didn't just mine salt for themselves. They traded it across Europe. The word salt itself comes from the Latin sal, a nod to the trade networks and cultural influence that grew from places like Hallstatt. Salt here wasn't just about keeping food fresh. It was the engine of an economy, the reason for roads, and the cause of alliances and rivalries. Meanwhile, in China, salt was too important to leave in private hands. During the Han Dynasty, the government took control, one of China's first state monopolies. Salt revenue funded armies, built roads, and paid for walls that stretched across the horizon. The salt monopoly wasn't just about money, it was about power. Whoever controlled the salt controlled the empire's future. This wasn't a hidden tax or a side business. It was the backbone of state finances, and it kept the machinery of empire running. The Egyptians used natron, salt, to preserve bodies, trying salt to both life and afterlife. Mummification required enormous quantities of salt, and the entire process depended on it. Salt wasn't just a tool for the living, it was a bridge to eternity. a guarantee that the dead would make it to the other side. Even in death, salt held sway. Salt's importance depended on geography. If you lived near a salt spring or a coastal marsh, you had access. If not, you depended on trade or tribute. This created sharp divisions between regions, those with salt and those without. These lines shaped trade routes and often led to conflict. In medieval Europe, rulers taxed salt heavily. France's infamous gabelle, a salt tax, became so hated that it helped fuel the French Revolution. When something as basic as salt became too expensive, people didn't just grumble, they rebelled. Venice, for example, built its fortune on salt. The city traded salt with the Byzantine Empire and far beyond, turning a swampy lagoon into a center of wealth and power. Venetian merchants controlled salt routes and production, and the city flourished. Salt wasn't just another trade good, it was the reason Venice mattered. The city's rise wasn't about luck or geography alone, it was about dominating the salt trade. Armies depended on salt just as much as empires did. Without it, soldiers couldn't preserve rations, and campaigns would grind to a halt. Salt kept armies moving, allowed them to travel farther, and fed them during long sieges or marches. If an army lost access to salt, it often lost the war. Salt funded campaigns, filled supply wagons, and kept troops alive. On the battlefield, salt was as important as swords or shields. Across the Atlantic, the story was much the same. The Aztecs built salt pans around Lake Texcoco and used salt cakes as tribute. People paid their taxes in salt, no coins. Salt was a measure of wealth and a symbol of power. It shaped social hierarchies and decided who prospered and who struggled. In these societies, salt wasn't just a commodity, it was currency. Status and security rolled into one. Scarcity made salt precious, but function made it essential. It preserved food, healed wounds, and kept trade moving. Gold and silver glittered in the markets, but salt kept people alive. It was the one thing you couldn't substitute or do without. That's why salt became the backbone of early economies, the fuel for armies, and the foundation for cities and states. Salt shaped not just economies, but landscapes, roads, ports, and entire trade systems grew up around its production and transport. Towns sprang up where salt was found or traded. Rivers became highways for salt barges. Salt determined where people lived, how they traveled, and what they fought for. Next, the roads glittering white with salt. Picture a caravan stretching across a barren desert, shimmering under the heat. Camels plod forward, their backs heavy with sacks of salt. Somewhere ahead, traders rehearse deals in their heads, knowing just how much wealth each grain represents. Behind them, A trail of footprints vanishes into the sand. For centuries, these caravans weren't just a moving cargo. They were moving the future, and at the heart was salt, a resource that turned distant regions into centers of commerce, culture, and power. When you hear the name Timbuktu, you might imagine a lost city at the edge of the world. But in the 14th century, Timbuktu was the beating heart of a global trade network. Its power? Salt. Located just south of Sahara, Timbuktu became the meeting point for traders from north and south. Salt mined in Tagasa under harsh conditions was loaded onto camel caravans and carried across the Sahara for up to 2,000 kilometers. The journey was brutal, scorching by day, freezing by night. Caravans faced sandstorms and bandits in equal measure, and sometimes entire groups vanished, claimed by the desert. The salt that survived the journey wasn't just a commodity. It was a lifeline for the cities that bought it, fueling economies and transforming Timbuktu into a center of knowledge, wealth, and influence. Tagasa itself was the definition of bleak. There were no crops, no real homes, just salt mines and workers living off imported food. The land was so salty and barren that nothing grew. Miners hacked slabs of salt from earth with basic tools, stacked them, and watched as their labor became the backbone of a trade network stretching across continents. Without Tagasa, the connection between West Africa and the Mediterranean might have never existed as they did. The salt from these mines didn't just keep people alive, it kept entire economies running. But salt didn't just travel across Africa. Caravans carried more than just slabs of mineral. They carried stories, ideas, and innovation. Timbuktu, for example, became a hub of learning, attracting scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. Its libraries and schools thrived, especially under King Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire. Salt funded the trade that made this possible. The movement of salt made it possible for ideas to move too, blending cultures, languages, and tradition as much as it blended economies. Europe had its own salt stories. Take Salzburg, literally Salt Castle in Austria. The city's name says it all. Its wealth came from salt mines, and controlling those mines meant controlling the city's fortune. The pattern repeats in Tuzla, Bosnia. Tuz means salt. These weren't random names. The very geography of these cities was shaped by the presence of salt. Cities like Salzburg and Tuzla didn't appear by accident. They grew where salt could be found, processed and shipped. If you control a salt mine, you control the growth of your city and the flow of wealth. Of course, wherever salt moved, power struggles followed. Control of salt routes meant control of trade, and that meant conflict. Take the rivalry between Venice and Genoa. These two city-states fought over more than pride. The real prize was control of the salt routes across the Adriatic Sea, routes that decided who would profit and who would lose out. Wars over land and religion were common, but wars for salt trade control, that's how vital salt was. Salt production wasn't quite a affair in Northern Europe either. In places like England and the Netherlands, people cultivated salt marshes and boiled seawater in massive pans. The resulting salt was packed in barrels and shipped out. Here, salt was more than survival, it was wealth and status, a way to gain influence on a much larger stage. Entire local economies depended on the ability to produce and export salt, and the town that mastered this trade flourished. Salt shaped culture too. Its influence is buried in language. Today you might call someone worth their salt, or refer to the salt of the earth. These phrases go back to a time when salt's value was obvious to everyone. Even the word salary, it's a reminder that salt was once a form of payment. The language we use is a fossil record of salt's importance. But the most remarkable thing about these routes is how they moved more than just salt. The Trans-Saharan Trade Network connected scholars, traders and travelers from different worlds. Islamic scholarship in North Africa met the tradition of West Africa, blended spiritual, intellectual life in new ways. Salt trade routes weren't just commercial highways. They were channels for culture, religion and ideas. The movement of salt helped create the condition for cities like Timbuktu to become centers of learning and exchange. By the end of the Middle Ages, salt wasn't just a mineral, it was infrastructure, shaping roads, cities, and even languages. The trade routes built for salt turned into arteries of global commerce, laying the groundwork for future economies. Civilizations built their relationships, economic and cultural, on the back of this trade. But as salt routes flourished, so did the urge to control them, sometimes by force. What do mummies, monopolies, and rebels have in common? Strangely enough, they all trace back to salt. For most of history, salt wasn't just a kitchen staple. It was a symbol of control, wealth, and the length people would go to either keep it or get it. Once rulers realized just how much power came with salt, they wasted no time turning it into a tool for domination. Let's start in China. During the Han Dynasty, running an empire meant finding new ways to fund endless wars, road building, and that giant bureaucracy. The answer was simple: take over the things people couldn't live without. Salt and iron became state monopolies. The government didn't just tax salt, they owned the entire process from extraction to sale. Every grain of salt passed through imperial hands before it hit anyone's table. This wasn't just about filling their treasury, it was about making sure the empire's survival and everyone living in it was linked directly to the power of the state. Salt, of course, was essential. Soldiers needed it to keep their rations edible through long campaigns. Farmers needed it for livestock, Even ancient doctors prescribed it for wound and illness. So, if you wanted to eat, heal, or keep your animals alive, you depended on the hand government supply. In a world where access to salt was never guaranteed, you could feel the state's grips in every mouthful. That kind of control breeds resentment, especially when your daily life depends on someone else's rules. Egypt had its own version of this story. Here, salt shaped not just life, but death. Natural salt for mummification reinforced the elite's control over afterlife rites. If you wanted your loved ones or yourself to make that journey to the next world, you needed access to natron. And who controlled the natron? The powerful. They could decide who got the proper send off and who didn't. Salt wasn't just about food or trade, it was about spiritual security and the ultimate status symbol. This pattern, controlled salt, controlled people, shows up again and again. Move forward to medieval Europe, and salt is no longer just a necessity, it's a luxury, and it's taxed to the hilt. In France, the gabelle became infamous. The salt tax forced all citizens to purchase a set amount each year, no matter the age or income. Refused, and you risked fines, prison, or worse. Even the poorest families had to scrape together enough to meet their quota. While the monarchy watched its coffers swell, it wasn't just an economic burden, it was a daily reminder of who held the power. People didn't take it quietly. Smugglers appeared everywhere, sneaking salt across borders or stashing it in hidden compartments. Thousands were caught and thrown in jail. Some were executed, but the defiance never really stopped. In fact, the gabelle became one of the most hated policies in French history, a symbol of royal greed and indifference. It helped set the stage for the French Revolution, when ordinary people finally snapped after years of being squeezed for every last grain. When you're forced to pay through the nose of something as basic as salt, it's not just about the money, it's about dignity and survival. Salt taxes didn't just spark quiet rebellion, sometimes they led directly to open conflict. In 1540, Pope Paul III imposed a salt tax in Perugia, Italy. The city refused to comply, and violence broke out. The Salt War ended with Perugia defeated and the tax enforced, but the memory of the fight lingered as proof that people would risk everything to protect their right to salt. The story is the same in smaller ways too. Across France, entire villages ignore the gabelle, smuggling and sharing salt despite the risk. These weren't just the petty crimes, they were acts of resistance, a way to reclaim a bit of control from a system that demanded obedience in exchange for survival. These authorities tried to crack down, but the smuggling networks only grew. For many, breaking the salt laws became a badge of honor. It was about more than avoiding a tax. It was about refusing to let someone else profit from your basic needs. Salt's grip on society went deeper than just economics. It was a lifeline, and those who controlled it controlled life itself. When rulers used salt to tighten their hold, people fought back, sometimes with smuggling, sometimes with riots, sometimes with outright war. The struggle over salt was a struggle over power, and the scars it left shaped governments and revolution for centuries. Salt's importance didn't fade quietly. The gabelle was eventually abolished during the French Revolution, but only after it became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. In Persia, the Salt War became a lesson in what happens when leaders push their people too far. In China and Egypt, the memory of salt control lived on in the way people remember their rulers, not as caretakers, but as gatekeepers to life and death. So, what does all this mean? Salt was never just about flavor or preservation. It was about who got to decide what you could eat, how you could live, and how even you could die. When people's access to salt was threatened, they pushed back, sometimes quietly, sometimes with open rebellion. Salt was a lifeline. Those who controlled it controlled life itself, and the people fought back. Can a pinch of salt ignite a movement? History says yes. There are moments in history when something as basic as salt becomes the spark for something much bigger. The revolution it inspired weren't about taste or convenience. They were about survival, dignity, and the right to control life's essentials. Nowhere does this come into sharper focus than in India in 1930, when a handful of salt became a lightning rod for resistance. Let's set the scene. India, under British colonial rule, was subject to a strict salt monopoly. The British government controlled every grain, forcing Indians to buy salt only from official sources at prices inflated by heavy taxes. Salt wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, needed for health, for preserving food, for everyday life. But the British monopoly made it illegal for Indians to collect or sell their own salt, even though the stuff literally formed along the country's coastline. For millions, especially the poorest, this policy was more than a nuisance. It was a daily hardship that hit hardest where people could least afford it. If you were a fisherman trying to keep your catch fresh or a farmer preserving food for lean times, the salt tax was a constant reminder of your lack of control. Enter Mahatma Gandhi. At age 60, dressed in plain homespun cloth, he set out on a 240-mile march from Sabarmati Ashram to the Arabian Sea. He wasn't alone. Thousands joined him, walking together under a relentless sun, stopping in village after village. People lined the route, offering water, food, and encouragement. The goal was simple but radical: to reach the sea and pick up a lump of salt. No weapons, no shouting, no grand speeches, just a quiet, determined act of defiance. When Gandhi finally reached the coastline and bent down to collect natural salt, it was anything but ordinary. News of the march spread across India and around the world. Reporters captured the moment, and suddenly, the British salt monopoly was no longer just a line in a law book. It was a symbol of injustice. Gandhi's action was peaceful, but it was a direct challenge to the British authority. The message was clear. The right to salt was the right to self-determination. The aftermath was immediate and dramatic. People all over India began collecting salt from their local sources, openly breaking the law. Others boiled seawater on rooftops, producing salt in tiny batches. The British response was swift. Fines and imprisonment for anyone caught defying the salt laws. Over 60,000 people were arrested, including Gandhi himself. But the crackdown only fueled the movement. Each arrest drew more people into the cause, and each act of resistance chipped away at the sense of British invisibility. Even those far from the coast found ways to protest, whether by smuggling salt or refusing to buy British salt altogether. The Salt March didn't topple the British Empire overnight, but it did something just as important. It exposed the cracks in colonial rule, showing ordinary people that the system could be challenged, and that they weren't alone. The movement drew in millions, uniting them around a cause that was both practical and symbolic. Salt, once a simple mineral, became a rallying cry for freedom. This wasn't the first time salt had played this role. In 18th century France, the infamous gabelle, a government-imposed salt tax, forced every citizen to buy a set amount of salt each year, regardless of their needs or income. The burden was heavy, especially for rural communities. It was forbidden by law for anyone to try to obtain salt outside of the official system, and the penalties were severe. But people didn't just accept it. Smuggling became common. Rural workers, known as forçonniers, risked fines and jail time to supply their neighbors with untaxed salt. These weren't professional criminals. They were ordinary people, farmers, laborers, fishermen, pushed to the margins by a system that put profit over fairness. The authorities tried to stamp out smuggling with harsh punishment, but the network only grew. Smuggling became more than a way to save money. It was a way to push back, to reclaim a sliver of autonomy from a government that seemed intent on squeezing every last coin out of its people. While salt smuggling alone didn't bring down the monarchy, it fed a growing resentment that helped fuel the French Revolution. The gabelle became a symbol of everything wrong with the old order: arbitrary, oppressive, and blind to the needs of ordinary people. Salt's role as a catalyst for change wasn't limited to these headline moments. Across the world, whenever salt was turned into a tool of control, people found ways to resist. In Russia, salt riots erupted in the 17th century when the government raised taxes on salt, leading to unrest and even violence. In colonial America, British salt taxes and blockades contributed to the anger that sparked revolution. Time and again, salt's importance made it a pressure point, an easy way for rulers to assert control, and an equally easy way for subjects to push back. What stands out is how quickly salt shifted from being a preserver of food to a symbol of defiance. The same mineral that kept meat from spoiling and fish from rotting became a marker of who held power and who was willing to challenge it. When authorities tried to monopolize salt, they often found themselves facing resistance that was stubborn, creative, and sometimes explosive. In the end, salt stories is about more than the mineral itself. It's about the people who relied on it and the length they would go to protect their access. It's about the quiet strength of communities who refused to be dictated to by distant rulers. And it's about how something so ordinary could carry the weight of hope, rebellion, and change. But as time went on, the world changed. New technologies began to loosen salt's grip on daily life. The rise of refrigeration and other preservation methods meant that people no longer depended on salt the way they once did. The age of salt monopolies and salt-fueled revolutions faded, replaced by new challenges and new symbols. Salt went from preserver to protest, and then, almost quietly, to something else entirely. The world doesn't always notice when old power quietly slips away, but that's exactly what happens with salt. For centuries, it was the backbone of food preservation, the reason for trade routes, taxes, and revolutions. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, a new technology arrived that changed everything: refrigeration. With the first ice boxes, people began packing food in chilled compartments lined with blocks of ice. Suddenly, you didn't need to salt every cut of meat or every fish just to make it through the week. The shift picked up speed as electric refrigerators became common in homes in early 20th century. Now, food could last for days or even weeks without a single grain of salt. It's harder to overstate how much this changed daily life. For thousands of years, salt was the line between feast and famine. Then, almost overnight, it became optional. This wasn't just a minor update to how people stored food, it was a total rewrite. Salt's monopoly on preservation was finished. Where once entire economies and empires depended on producing, trading, and taxing salt, now people could simply buy a fridge and keep their food fresh with chilled air. Salt still had its places in pickling, curing, and fermenting, but the days when it was the matter of survival were over. Imagine the contrast. Generations of people spent their lives worrying about how to get enough of salt, and then, in a matter of decades, the anxiety faded into the background. But salt didn't vanish from daily life. It adapted. If you're looking for survival, salt is the master of reinvention. While it no longer sits at the center of global power, it's still everywhere, just in ways you might not notice at first glance. In modern times, salt's uses have multiplied far beyond the kitchen. It's a key ingredient in producing chemicals like chlorine and caustic soda, which are essential for making everything from plastics and paper to detergents and medicines. Salt keeps highways safe in the winter, spread across ice roads to melt snow and preventing accidents. Water treatment plants rely on salt to soften hard water, protecting pipes and appliances in homes and businesses. Salt has even found its way into the system that keeps your home running, quietly making sure water flows and machinery doesn't size up. It's not the star of the show anymore, but it's still working behind the scenes, doing jobs that most people never think about. Culturally, salt hasn't lost its grip either. It still shows up in rituals and traditions all over the world. There are religious ceremonies that use salt for purification, blessings, or protection. People toss salt over the left shoulder for luck, a habit that goes back centuries. Even our language is dotted with reminders of salt's old importance. Phrases like worth your salt or salty attitude are little echoes of time when the salt was a sign of value or a source of bitterness. These aren't just linguistic leftovers, they are clues to how deeply salt is woven into our collective memory. Biologically, you're never really free from salt either. Every cell in your body contains sodium, and you need it for your muscle to contract, your blood to flow, and your nerves to send signals. If you ever try to go without salt for more than a day or two, you know your body quickly reminds you who's in charge. Even if you never think about it, salt is keeping you alive, minute by minute. And let's not forget the kitchen. Even today, salt enhances flavor in ways no substitute can match. It's the ingredient that ties a dish together, brings out the sweetness in tomatoes, and makes a steak taste like steak. Every great meal relies on it. Whether you're eating street food or fine dining, chefs and home cooks alike know there's no real replacement. Salt's power to transform food is as real now as it was in ancient times, even if we use it differently. What's interesting is how salt's story mirrors the bigger shift in human history. When people needed it for survival, they fought wars, built roads, and paid taxes for it. When new technology made it less essential, salt simply found new roads. It's still in your kitchen, but now it's also on your roads, in your water, and in the products you use every day. Its role has changed, but its presence has never faded. The end of salt's monopoly didn't mean the end of its importance. Instead, it marked a new chapter. Salt became a quiet constant, no longer the source of the revolts or royal decrees, but still essential in ways most people never see. It's a reminder that even when something stops ruling the world, it doesn't just disappear. It adapts, slips into new jobs, and keeps working behind the scenes. Salt's history isn't just a list of dates or inventions. It's a record of how people adapt, how technology shapes what we value, and how the things we take for granted can be the same things that once changed the course of civilization. If you look around, you will see that salt is still with us, in ways both obvious and hidden. It's in your food, your language, your rituals, and your infrastructure. And while you might not think about it as you go about your day, salt hasn't lost its ability to connect us to the past. It's a thread running through history, tying ancient empires to modern cities, and reminding us that what seems ordinary can have a story all in its own. Sometimes the most familiar things are the ones with the deepest roots. Salt's journey from necessity to everyday staple is still unfolding, and its legacy is never far beneath the surface. If you ever find yourself in Poland, There's a place beneath the earth where salt doesn't just hide in veins of rock. It stands as a proof that something so basic can leave a mark far bigger than its size. The Vielska salt mine stretches for miles underground, a monument to centuries of continuous operation. Generations of miners didn't just dig for salt, they carved out entire worlds. The centerpiece is the chapel of St. Kinga, an enormous underground church made entirely of salt. The walls, the altar, the steps, and even the chandeliers, all salt, cut and shaped by hand, left behind as a record of both faith and skill. Walking through this space, you're surrounded by the work of people who spent their lives underground, turning a necessity into something lasting, something beautiful, and something that still draws visitors from around the world. It's easy to forget how much effort went into extracting salt, but places like Vietska make it impossible to ignore. Here, the work was hard and often dangerous, yet, even in those conditions, miners found ways to carve meaning and pride into their labor. The chapel of Saint Kinga isn't just a tourist stop. It's a reminder that salt shaped daily life, and that people responded by giving it the kind of reverence. The mine's halls are lined with carvings that outlasted the hands that made them. Proof that salt's story is as much about people as it is about minerals. But salt's legacy isn't only buried underground. You carry pieces of it in your own language, probably without realizing it. When you say someone is worth one salt, you're echoing a time when salt was so valuable it measured a person's worth, sometimes even as a payment. If you mention someone rubbing salt in the wound, you're reaching back to the days when salt was used to treat injuries. Painfully, yes, but sometimes the only way to keep things from getting worse. These phrases aren't just old sayings. They are reminders of how salt once shaped value, pain, and even survival. Every time you use them, you're keeping a little bit of that history alive. You see, this kind of echoes everywhere. Salt's impact lingers in the way people think about value, fairness, and even insult. It's not just in items either. Salt shows up in rituals, grains thrown over shoulders for luck, lines of salt poured at thresholds for protection, salt shared as sign of hospitality. These customs aren't just superstitions. They are leftovers of a world where salt was precious enough to be guarded, blessed, or even thought of. If you step back and think about it, salt is one of the few things that manage to stick with us from the earliest days of civilization to now. People have fought wars with salt, taxed it, smuggled it, carved it, and worshipped with it. Salt was at the center of revolts and revolutions. But it also built cathedrals underground and slipped quietly into everyday life. Its story is full of tension between necessity and luxury, between survival and art, between pain and healing. Salt's presence in food is still a daily reminder of its power. Sure, you don't need to preserve meat with salt anymore, but you notice if it's disappeared from the kitchen. Salt doesn't just make things taste salty, it draws out flavors, balances bitterness, and turns bland into delicious. Every culture has its own way of using salt, whether it's sprinkled on fresh tomatoes, stirred into stews, or packed around fish before roasting. The science is simple. Salt helps your taste buds to do their job. The result is a link between every meal you eat and thousands of years of human history. Even now, when salt is as cheap and accessible as it's ever been, there is a kind of respect that lingers. You see it in the careful way chefs season food, in the stories people tell about the best salt for finishing a dish, in the rituals that still survive at dinner tables and in ceremonies. Salt's role has changed, but it hasn't vanished. It just moved from the center of power to the background. Always there, always important, even if you don't have to think about it. When you look at the big picture, salt isn't just a mineral or a condiment, it's a thread running through art, language, food, and memory. The Wieleczka salt mine stands as a monument to what people can do with determination and creativity, even when working with something as ordinary as salt. The idioms you use, the food you eat, the tradition you follow, they all carry traces of salt influence. It's not just a history in a textbook, it's alive in the way you live today. So, next time you reach for the salt shaker, pause for a second. You're not just adding flavor, you're picking up a piece of the past. Something that shaped empires, inspired art, and found its way into the words you use every day. Salt binds past and present. One pinch is history in your hand. Think back to those camel caravans inching across the Sahara, or the silent halls of Wieleczka's chapel, carved from the salt deep underground. Salt's story isn't just about what's on your table. It's about the way something so ordinary shaped cities, fueled trade, and quietly threaded itself through every part of daily life. It's easy to overlook, but its influence stretches back further than written language, connecting us to the earth and to each other. If this quiet journey through time brought you calm curiosity, consider subscribing for more soothing history. Thanks for joining me tonight, and I'll see you on the next gentle adventure. Thank you for listening and watching.